Okay, so you guys sent in some pretty wild stuff this week.
Yeah.
One article we got asked if running a marathon could actually lead to your brain eating itself.
Oh, wow.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Talk about a great conversation starter. So get ready, because we're diving headfirst into this super interesting world where extreme endurance sports and brain function collide.
Yeah, exactly. You want all the juicy knowledge without having to wade through tons of complicated research, right?
Right.
Well, that's exactly what we're here for today. Think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding the key findings from those scientific studies and reports you sent about how running impacts your brain.
Exactly. So we're looking at this one study about marathon runners and this crazy idea that their brains might be using myelin as fuel.
Right.
And then we'll also look at some broader research on the neurological benefits of running in general.
Yeah, sounds good.
Our goal is to really get what's going on up there in our brains when we push ourselves to the limit physically, and why that might be happening. And what does all of this tell us about brain health overall? Maybe even conditions like MS. We want to give you those aha moments, but without totally overwhelming you with all the sciencey stuff.
Okay, let's do it.
So let's start with that attention-grabbing headline, shall we?
Sure.
Marathon running and your brain basically eating itself. This idea comes from a study that was published in Nature Metabolism.
Okay.
And the main takeaway is that while you're running a marathon, if your body happens to run out of its usual fuel, which is carbohydrates,
Yeah.
it might actually start using the myelin in your brain as like a backup energy source.
Whoa, hold on. Myelin. Can you remind us what exactly that is again?
Yeah, good point. Not everyone's a brain expert.
Right.
So basically, myelin is like this protective fatty coating that surrounds the long fibers of your brain cells, which are called axons.
Okay.
And these axons are what transmit electrical signals, which allows your brain cells to talk to each other quickly and efficiently. What this study is suggesting is that in extreme situations like running a marathon, when your body is desperate for energy, your myelin might act as like an emergency fuel reserve.
That's pretty wild. So how did the researchers figure this out? Like, you can't just look inside someone's head while they're running, right?
Right. That's a good question. Well, they use these really advanced MRI scans to look at the brains of marathon runners at 3 different points in time. Before the race, a couple weeks after the race, and then again 2 months later.
Oh, so they tracked them over time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they weren't actually directly measuring the myelin itself, but rather something called myelin water fraction,
Okay.
which is like a clue that tells them about the myelin levels. It's kind of like a detective looking for evidence, right?
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
So what did these brain scans actually reveal? What was going on right after those runners finished the marathon?
So the scans that were taken within 24 to 48 hours after the marathon actually showed a decrease in myelin in 12 specific areas of the brain's white matter.
Oh, wow. In specific areas.
Yeah, and these areas are all involved in how we coordinate our movements and how our senses and emotions work together.
Interesting.
One of the researchers named Carlos Matute pointed out that these areas are basically essential for everything we do physically and how we feel emotionally.
Right. So after pushing yourself that hard during a marathon, you might temporarily have less of this really important myelin in parts of your brain that help you move and feel. I mean, that sounds a little bit scary, even if it's temporary, right?
Yeah, it does sound a little freaky at first.
Yeah.
But luckily, there's more to the story. So what happened in those follow-up scans?
Well, at the 2-week mark, there was already significant recovery. Another researcher, Pedro Ramos Cabrera, noted that the myelin levels had actually increased quite a bit, but they hadn't completely gone back to their pre-race levels yet.
So they were on their way back to normal.
Exactly. It's a clear sign that the brain was already starting to repair itself.
Okay, so what about the final check-in? What did those scans show 2 months out?
By that 2-month scan, the myelin levels in all 12 of those areas had completely recovered.
Ah, phew.
Yeah, they were back to where they were before the marathon. So this is really important. It seems to be a temporary effect and only in healthy people.
That is reassuring. So this whole brain eating itself thing is more like a temporary borrowing situation, not permanent damage.
Right.
But why would the brain even do this in the first place? It seems kind of risky to mess with something as crucial as myelin,
Yeah.
for communication and all that.
That's where their metabolic safety net theory comes into play.
Okay.
They're basically suggesting that myelin is like a handy emergency energy source. So when the brain's main fuel supply, which is glucose, gets super low during extreme physical activity, it can dip into these fatty myelin sheaths for a little boost.
Like a backup generator almost.
Exactly. And get this, they even coined the term myelin metabolic plasticity to describe this amazing ability of the brain to switch up its fuel sources.
Okay, metabolic plasticity. That's a totally new way to think about the brain. So it's not just static, it can actually break down and rebuild itself as needed, at least under these really intense circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. And this actually adds another layer to this idea we have about the brain's incredible ability to adapt, which we call neuroplasticity.
Right.
This study is basically showing us that there's a metabolic side to this adaptability as well.
That's super cool. So we've been talking about a single marathon here. What about when people push themselves even further? You mentioned another study about ultra-marathoners, right?
Yeah, the Trans-Europe Foot Race study is a really fascinating comparison.
Okay.
While those marathon runners only had temporary changes in their myelin, the ultramarathoners in this study ran for 64 days straight. And their brain scans showed about a 6% decrease in the volume of their gray matter.
Wow, 64 days. That's insane.
I know, right? And to put that 6% decrease in perspective, the typical age-related gray matter reduction is only like a 0.2% per year.
Whoa, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, it's way more significant.
But was that reversible too? That sounds a bit alarming.
The good news is yes. 8 months after the race, the brain volume of these ultra runners had completely returned to normal.
Oh, thank goodness.
It seems like running's impact on the brain exists on a spectrum, you know?
Yeah.
It probably depends on the intensity and duration of the exercise.
So it's like a temporary blip for marathon runners, but a much more substantial but still reversible change for those hardcore ultramarathoners.
Exactly.
So what about those of us who are, just casual runners hitting the pavement a few times a week? Are there any brain benefits for us regular folks?
Definitely. This is where a lot of exciting research comes in. Studies on more moderate running have shown some really positive cognitive effects.
Okay, like what?
For example, a study from West Michigan University found that even a quick 30-minute run can improve something called cortical flicker frequency threshold.
Okay, I have no idea what that means.
Think of it as how fast your brain can process a series of flashing lights.
Okay.
A higher threshold basically means your brain is processing information faster, so you might actually think a little quicker after a run.
So that clear head feeling you get after a good jog might be a real neurological thing.
Exactly. And there's more research from Lithuanian Sports University and Nottingham Trent University actually found that interval running, those short bursts of high intensity with recovery periods in between.
Yeah.
They found that this type of running can actually boost your executive function.
And remind me, what exactly does executive function cover?
It includes things like your ability to pay attention, focus, switch between tasks, and problem solve, all that good stuff.
That's really useful.
Yeah, they saw improvements even after just 10 minutes of sprinting, and the benefits just kept building up over a 7-week training period.
That's great news for anyone who wants to sharpen their mental game. So you also mentioned a study about the brain activity of experienced runners, right? What did that one find?
Yes. David Rachlin and his team at the University of Arizona used brain imaging to compare experienced runners with people who didn't run regularly.
Yeah.
And they found increased coordinated activity in the frontal brain regions of the runners.
Yeah.
Which are the parts of your brain that are super important for those executive functions and working memory that we just talked about.
Right.
But here's the really interesting part. They also saw reduced activity in the default mode network in the runners.
Now, the default mode network, isn't that the part of the brain that's kind of always active when we're daydreaming or just lost in our own thoughts?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like when you're zoning out in a meeting or mentally making your grocery list, it's that internal chatter that can sometimes be linked to negative thought patterns.
Oh, so running can actually help quiet that inner voice.
Well, that's what this study suggests. The fact that the default mode network is less active in experienced runners even when they're resting suggests that running might help calm all that mental noise. Rachlin and his team even went so far as to propose that running could be a form of mindfulness in motion.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. Like going for a run could give you some of the same mental benefits as meditation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea.
It definitely makes sense with that feeling of being more focused and less distracted after a good run.
Yeah, for sure. And beyond the cognitive benefits, running also has a big impact on our mood and stress levels.
Okay, how so?
Yeah, there's some pretty fascinating biochemical pathways involved.
Okay, you mentioned something called the kynurenine pathway earlier, didn't you?
I did. It does sound a bit like something out of a textbook, but the main thing to know is this. When you're stressed, your body converts an amino acid called tryptophan into kynurenine.
Yeah.
And some of this kynurenine can cross into your brain, and when it's at high levels, it's been linked to things like depression and anxiety.
It says not good.
No, not really. But here's where running comes in. A study from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden found that during exercise, an enzyme in your muscles called kynurenine aminotransferase increases.
Yeah.
And this enzyme actually breaks down kynurenine into a form that can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So basically, your muscles act as a filter, stopping this potentially mood-dampening stuff from reaching your brain.
So it's like your muscles are cleaning up your bloodstream to protect your mental well-being.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how connected your brain and body really are.
That's amazing. Of course, we can't talk about running and mood without mentioning that famous runner's high.
Oh, yeah, the legendary runner's high. I think everyone has heard of that.
Everyone thinks it's all about endorphins, right? Is that the whole story?
Well, not quite. It's true that beta endorphin levels go up in your blood during a run.
Right.
But there's a bit of a problem with the whole endorphin hypothesis.
Oh, what's that?
Well, beta endorphins don't actually cross that easily from your blood into your brain because of that pesky blood-brain barrier.
Right, the gatekeeper.
Exactly. So it wasn't clear how those endorphins were actually causing that feeling of euphoria.
So what's the updated version of this story?
A group of German neuroscientists did some really interesting research back in 2008. They used brain imaging and found that after longer runs, like 2 hours or more, the beta endorphin levels actually do peak in the brain. And these increased levels matched up perfectly with the feelings of euphoria that the runners reported. So endorphins do seem to play a role, especially when you're running for longer periods.
Okay, so endorphins are definitely part of the equation, particularly for those long hauls. But you also mentioned something called endocannabinoids.
Right.
That sounds kind of like cannabis.
It does, and that's because endocannabinoids are compounds that are naturally produced by your body, and they have similar effects to the active ingredients in cannabis. And get this, their levels increase after about 30 minutes of moderate intensity running. Studies on animals have shown that these exercise-induced endocannabinoids can actually reduce anxiety and how we perceive pain.
Wow.
And it's highly likely that they also contribute to those good vibes we get after a run. It's like your body's natural mood booster.
So it's not just endorphins, but this whole cocktail of brain chemicals working together to give us that post-run bliss.
Exactly. Now let's bring it all back to that myelin study and all of these amazing brain effects we've been talking about. What does all of this mean for how we understand and maybe even treat certain conditions?
Well, the researchers who did the myelin study were particularly interested in the potential connection to multiple sclerosis, or MS.
Right.
So how could their findings be relevant to that?
As you know, MS is a disease that attacks the myelin sheaths around those nerve fibers in the brain and spinal cord, which really messes with communication between your brain and your body.
Okay.
Carlos Matute actually pointed out that understanding how myelin in healthy runners can bounce back so quickly after a marathon could be a game changer for developing new therapies for MS and other demyelinating conditions.
Wow, that's huge.
It's like the rapid repair mechanisms we see in healthy brains under extreme duress could hold the key to figuring out how to kickstart myelin regeneration in people with MS.
That would be incredible. So should marathon runners be worried about their brains borrowing from their myelin reserves, even if it is temporary?
The researchers who conducted that study are very clear that their findings don't mean people should stop running marathons.
Okay.
The physical health benefits of endurance exercise are undeniable. However, they do suggest that people who already have pre-existing demyelinating conditions might want to exercise a bit more caution and maybe talk to their doctors.
Yeah, that's good advice. Are there any limitations with these studies or anything else we should keep in mind?
Definitely. The myelin study, while groundbreaking, only involved a small number of participants.
Right.
And remember, they were looking at myelin water fraction, which is an indirect measure of myelin levels. It would be great to see future research that uses more direct methods to confirm their findings.
Okay, that makes sense.
And of course, it's super important to remember that everyone responds differently to exercise. It depends on your genes, your training history, your overall health, all sorts of things.
So it's a complex picture, but we've learned a lot.
We have, and it really underscores just how incredibly adaptable our brains and bodies truly are.
All right, so let's wrap things up for you, our amazing listeners. Today, we did a deep dive into what happens inside your brain when you really challenge yourself physically through running.
Yeah.
We saw that extreme endurance events like marathons might make your brain tap into its myelin reserves for energy when its regular fuel runs low. But don't worry, It seems like this is a temporary and reversible process for healthy people.
Yeah.
We also explored all the incredible cognitive and mood benefits that are linked to running more regularly, like how it might be a form of mindfulness, how it can boost those executive functions, and how it can actually change the chemistry of your brain to reduce stress and improve your well-being.
And hopefully we gave you a clearer understanding of all these mind-blowing effects without getting too lost in the weeds.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. If our brains are as adaptable as this marathon study suggests, and if moderate exercise is so good for our minds and bodies, what other amazing ways might our bodies adapt and optimize our brain power under different types of physical or even environmental stresses? It's a pretty incredible thing to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
It really makes you wonder about that intricate connection between being active and having a brain that's always evolving. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.